Hello, I'm Majat Ahmed. I'm a visiting faculty at the OP Jindal Global University. The module is about India's response to HIV/AIDS. Now, let's look at the learning outcomes of the module. By the end of this module, the reader shall be able to understand the policy framework in India to combat HIV/AIDS, comprehend the constitutional guarantees important in the context of HIV/AIDS, to understand the legislative measures undertaken to protect the rights of persons infected or affected by HIV/AIDS. Laws and legal systems of a country have huge impact in the fight against HIV epidemic. While international human rights framework has a vital role in prevention of HIV, it's the progressive national laws which can contribute even more effectively in arresting the spread of the disease. Studies have shown that laws which criminalize same-sex sexual activity allow mandatory testing for HIV, prohibit condoms in prisons, etc. are obstacles in preventing HIV. A 2006 report of UNAIDS on the global AIDS epidemic reveals that despite widespread recognition that stigma and discrimination fuel spread of HIV, only 6 in 10 countries in the world have any laws or regulations that prohibit discrimination against those living with HIV. This module examines India's legal response to HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS in India, a situational analysis. Over the past 3 decades, since the first detection of HIV infection in commercial sex workers in Chennai, HIV has emerged as one of the most serious public health challenges and human rights issues in the country. While as a percentage of the overall population, the HIV prevalence rates in the country may seem low as 0.35%, it's actually high in absolute figures. According to the GAP report by UNAIDS published in 2014, India has the 3rd highest number of people living with HIV in the world in 2013 after South Africa and Nigeria with 2.1 million infected persons. This accounts for about 4 out of 10 people infected with HIV in the Asia-Pacific region. The epidemic is more prevalent among certain high-risk behavior groups like female sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender, and injecting drug users. According to the Annual Report 2014-15 of National AIDS Control Organization, also known as the NACP, targeted intervention has led to considerable decline in HIV prevalence among these groups. The highest prevalence of HIV/AIDS in the country was recorded from Nagaland, 0.88%, followed by Mizoram, 0.68%, Manipur, 0.64%, Andhra Pradesh, 0.59%, and Karnataka, 0.53%. Constitutional guarantees important in the context of HIV/AIDS. While there are no specific constitutional provisions mentioning the people living with HIV in the Indian Constitution, the principle of equality and non-discrimination embedded in the Constitution is crucial in the context of HIV. The mandate of Article 14 prohibiting discrimination extended by Articles 15 and 16 become critical for people living with HIV who are constantly subjected to widespread discrimination, be it in the matters on employment, education, healthcare, etc. Right to life and personal liberty enshrined in Article 21 of the Constitution is equally important for people infected or affected by HIV. It includes right to live with human dignity and all that goes along with it. Dignity often stands violated in the case of people living with HIV. Their basic right to life comes to a standstill with loss of jobs, barriers in access to educational and healthcare facilities, and other socio-economic and legal hurdles. The expression personal liberty is also of widest amplitude and covers a wide variety of rights. Autonomy of the individual is mostly violated when the people living with HIV or vulnerable to HIV are forced to mandatory testing. Other constitutional provisions which have particular significance in protecting the interests of persons affected by HIV are Article 19, which includes right to freedom of speech and expression, Article 19(1)(a), right to assembly, Article 19(1)(b), right to association, Article 19(1)(c), right to move freely throughout the territory of India, Article 19(1)(d), right to reside and settle in any part of the territory of India, Article 19(1)(e), and right to practice any profession or to carry on any occupation, trade or business, Article 19(1)(g). Then we have Article 20, providing protection in respect of conviction for offences. Article 21, making free and compulsory education a right of all children of the age of 6 to 14 years. Then comes Article 22, which gives protection against arrest and detention in certain cases. Article 23, providing the right against exploitation. Next is Article 32, providing the right to constitutional remedies. Then comes Article 38, requiring the state to secure a social order for the promotion of welfare of the people. Article 39, which includes certain policies to be followed by state, including securing right to an adequate means of livelihood, securing that the health and strength of workers and tender age of children are not abused, and ensuring that citizens are not forced by economic necessity to enter avocations unsuited for the age or strength. It directs the state to secure that children are given opportunities and facilities to develop in a healthy manner, in conditions of freedom and dignity, and childhood and youth are protected against exploitation and moral and material abandonment. Article 41, directing the state to secure within the limits of its economic capacity and development right to work, to education, and to public assistance in cases of unemployment, sickness, and disablement. Next is Article 42, which requires state to make provisions for just and humane conditions of work. Then comes Article 43, which requires state to secure living wage and conditions of work, ensuring a decent standard of life and social and cultural opportunities. Next is Article 47, which provides the duty of the state to raise the level of nutrition and standard of living and to improve public health. So now let's look at India's legal response to HIV/AIDS. A comparative analysis of compliance of 9 countries with the international legal norms in HIV/AIDS undertaken by the University of California, Los Angeles, also known as UCLA. UCLA School of Law places India second lowest position. No specific statute to address the issues arising of HIV/AIDS. There also exists inherent contradictions in many of the existing laws and policies. For instance, criminalization of sexual activity between men, soliciting for sex work, etc. goes against the global understanding in combating the epidemic and in effect impedes many vulnerable sections from getting detected and treated. A survey of the national legal response to HIV/AIDS is given below. Policies and programs. National AIDS Control Program, or the NACP. Soon after the detection of first AIDS case in the country, the National AIDS Committee was constituted in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in 1986. While in the initial years, focus of the committee was on the awareness generation, introduction of blood screening for transfusion purposes, and conducting surveillance activities in the epicenters of the epidemic in 1992, a multi-sectoral strategy for prevention and control of AIDS was formulated. The growing epidemic resulted in the launch of the country's first National AIDS Control Program, or NACP, in 1992, and the constitution of the National AIDS Control Organization, NACO, to implement the program. NACP is a 100% centrally sponsored scheme and currently in its fourth phase. NACP4, it aims to reduce new infections by 50%, 2000 baseline of NACP3, and provides comprehensive care, support and treatment to all persons living with HIV/AIDS. The key strategies divided to achieve these objectives include intensifying and consolidating prevention services with a focus on high-risk groups and vulnerable population, increasing access and promoting comprehensive care, support and treatment, expanding IEC services for general population and high-risk groups with a focus on behavioral change and demand generation, building capacities at national, state and district levels, and strengthening the strategic information management system. The 5 cross-cutting themes which are being focused on under NACP4 include quality, innovation, integration, leveraging partnerships, and stigma and discrimination. It has been criticized until recently that the government of India had mostly a prevention-only approach. However, there has been a rethinking on this strategy, and the NACO report of 2014-15 notes that prevention and care and support and treatment from the 2 key pillars of HIV/AIDS control efforts in the country. Now let's look at the National AIDS Prevention and Control Policy 2002. The National AIDS Prevention and Control Policy of 2002 places emphasis on the critical link between HIV/AIDS and human rights. It states that when human rights are protected, fewer people become infected, and those living with HIV/AIDS and their families can better cope with HIV/AIDS. Government recognizes that without the protection of the human rights of people who are vulnerable and afflicted with HIV/AIDS, the response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic will remain incomplete. It further calls attention to the fact that HIV/AIDS is not a mere public health challenge, but a development issue to which multi-sectoral response needs to be evolved. To achieve the general objective of preventing the epidemic from spreading further and controlling it, it charts out several strategies including awareness generation, ensuring availability of safe blood, etc. It also identifies certain issues as critical for bringing in a paradigm shift in the response to HIV/AIDS, both at the level of government and outside it. These comprise shifts in program management, strong advocacy, and social mobilization to fill the serious information gap, large-scale involvement of non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations at policy making, provision of services, training and capacity building, prevention and control of sexually transmitted diseases, use of condoms as HIV/AIDS prevention measures, HIV testing on a voluntary basis with appropriate pre-test and post-test counseling, expansion in counseling services, ensuring protection of right to privacy and other human rights, and proper care and support for people living with HIV, building up a proper surveillance system to assess the magnitude of HIV infections in the community, taking the increasing injecting drug use, ensuring safety of blood and blood products, encouraging and supporting research and development, and developing bilateral and international cooperation to fight the epidemic. Carving out an increasing role for state governments, it requires them to develop strong ownership of HIV/AIDS prevention and control and devise their own strategies and action programs to tackle the disease as the prevalence of the disease and its implications from states to states. Now let's look at the National Blood Policy, 2007. Ensuring easily accessible and adequate supply of state and quality blood and blood components is vital for the elimination of transfusion-transmitted infections. The blood banking system in the country is highly fragmented, lacking manpower, adequate infrastructure, and financial base. Being highly decentralized, the standards vary from state to state. The government, through this policy, aims at an integrated strategy, including collection of blood only from voluntary, non-remunerated blood donors, screening for all transfusion-transmitted infections, and reduction of unnecessary transfusion to ensure elimination of transfusion-transmitted infections and for provision of safe and adequate blood transfusion services to the people. To achieve this aim, it identifies certain objectives which are as follows. To reiterate firmly the government commitment to provide safe and adequate quantity of blood, blood components, and blood products. To make available adequate resources to develop and reorganize the blood transfusion services in the entire country. To make latest technology available for operating the blood transfusion services and ensure its functioning in an updated manner. To launch extensive awareness programs for donor information, education, motivation, recruitment, and retention in order to ensure adequate availability of safe blood. To encourage appropriate clinical use of blood and blood products. To strengthen the manpower through human resource development. To encourage research and development in the field of transfusion, medicine, and related technology. To take adequate regulatory and legislative steps for monitoring and evaluation of blood transfusion services, and to take steps to eliminate profiteering in blood banks. Now let's look at the National Policy on HIV and the World of Work, 2009. Although there is no scientific proof to show that HIV gets transmitted through ordinary workplace contact, rampant human rights abuses take place at the world of work. The effect of this is not limited to individual level, but transcends to household level and national economies too. Income of workers and supply of labor has got affected in those countries with high prevalence of HIV. Taking note of the impending crisis, especially as nearly as 90% of the reported HIV infections in the country fall in the most productive age group of 15 to 49 years, the Ministry of Labor and Employment and National AIDS Control Organization has jointly developed a national policy guideline on HIV/AIDS. Interventions in the world of work. It's especially important as the country still lacks a legislative framework on HIV/AIDS. A number of landmark judgments governing the issues related to the employment of people living with HIV and India's ratification of the ILO Convention number 111 on discrimination, employment and occupation provides relevant background for such a policy statement. Based on the principles of human rights, the policy aims to guide the national response to HIV/AIDS in reducing and managing the impact of epidemic in the world of work. It specifically aims to prevent transmission of HIV infection amongst workers and their families. 2. To protect rights of those who are infected and provide access to available care, support and treatment. 3. Protect workers from stigma and discrimination related to HIV/AIDS by assuring them equity and dignity at the workplace. Number 4. Ensure safe migration and mobility with access to information services on HIV/AIDS. It adopts the key principles of the ILO Code of Practice on HIV/AIDS and the world of work that is in line with the Government of India's National HIV/AIDS policy. The 10 guiding principles include identification of HIV/AIDS as a workforce issue, non-discrimination, gender equality, health work, environment, social dialogue, no screening for the purpose of employment, confidentiality, continuation of employment relationship, prevention and care and support. It requires HIV/AIDS policy and programs to be established in all constituents, ministries and their key institutions, employers and workers' organizations, public and private sector enterprises, multinational companies and civil society organizations, based on the principles and implementation guidelines enlisted therein. Significantly, the policy applies to all employers and workers, including applicants of work in the public as well as private sectors. All workplaces and contracts of employment and all aspects of work, formal and informal, and the self-employed worker, including the spouse and children or other dependent family members of a worker. A steering committee on HIV/AIDS and the world of work comprising of employers and the workers' organizations, development agencies, NACP, Ministry of Labor and Employment, and people living with HIV is also proposed to oversee, facilitate implementation of broad policy guidelines and take strategic decisions related to HIV/AIDS programs in the world of work in India. All the stakeholders who are responsible for implementing the workplace policy on HIV/AIDS are required to make suitable budgetary allocation for the various HIV prevention, care, and support programs to be undertaken by them. Now, let's look at the human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immune deficiency syndrome Prevention and Control Bill 2014. While some countries have enacted HIV legislations, there is no such legislation in India. Most of the legal issues arising in the context of HIV in the country have been dealt by the judiciary, whose approach to the issue is left to the predilections of individual judges. While a number of policies have been adopted by the country to combat the epidemic, it's of non-binding nature. On 11 February 2014, the Human Immunodeficiency Virus and Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome Prevention and Control Bill 2014, hereinafter HIV/AIDS Bill, was tabled in the Rajya Sabha. The process of drafting the HIV/AIDS Bill started in 1989. The first HIV/AIDS Bill was, however, subsequently withdrawn, as it had regressive provisions like mandatory testing and confinement of infected persons. Later in 2003, when the International Policymakers Conference on HIV/AIDS highlighted the need for such legislation, Lawyers Collective, an NGO which has done pioneering work in ensuring justice to those infected and affected by HIV/AIDS, was asked to develop a draft legislation on HIV. Though the draft has been prepared and submitted way back in 2006, it has still not been passed by the Parliament. The bill recognizes that there is an urgent need for the prevention and control of HIV/AIDS and also to protect and secure the human rights of persons who are HIV positive, affected by HIV/AIDS and vulnerable to it. Key provisions of the bill are given below. Defines discrimination on HIV-related grounds and prohibits discrimination in employment or occupation, healthcare services, educational establishments and services, accommodation, access or enjoyment of any good, service, etc. dedicated to the use or available to the public, government or private establishment, insurance, right to reside, movement, etc. Subject to certain exceptions, informed consent required for undertaking HIV test or treatment. Subject to certain exceptions, rights to privacy and confidentiality of a person with respect to disclosure of HIV status protected. Duty on a person who is HIV positive and has been counseled in accordance with the guidelines issued or is aware of the nature of HIV and its transmission to take all reasonable precautions to prevent the transmission of HIV to other people. Obligation on establishments keeping record of HIV-related information of protected persons to ensure confidentiality of data. Obligation on central and state governments for providing, as far as possible, antiretroviral therapy and opportunistic infection management to people living with HIV or AIDS. Obligation on the appropriate government to ensure protection of children affected by HIV and AIDS. Obligation of establishments to provide safe working environment and set up grievance redressal mechanism. Promotion of strategies for reduction of risk. Appointment of ombudsman by every state government to inquire into violations of the provisions of the legislation. Special provisions for protection of certain vulnerable sections, including women, children, persons in care of custody of government, etc. Now let's summarize. A lot of laws in the country are enacted as a result of knee-jerk reactions, and most of these have failed to achieve its objectives. Global evidence shows that the legal response against HIV needs to be evidence-based. The experience of civil society organizations being asked to frame HIV legislation in the country is encouraging. However, unfortunately, the draft legislation still waits to get through the Parliament. Although the National AIDS Prevention and Control Policy supports rights-based approach, it lacks the sanction of law. Most of the HIV jurisprudence in the country is today developed by courts. Certain legislative provisions still continue to be regressive. In order to realize India's commitment to protecting the lives of people living with HIV, it's crucial that the country strengthen the legal response to HIV/AIDS and pass the HIV legislation. Thank you very much.